The title is Making Pennsylvania a State Where Black Girls Thrive, Upcoming Legislation and Policy Initiatives with the Youth Safety Coalition. So first we have Stephanie, who is joining us. And Stephanie, I'm going to try to pronounce your last name, Arbutina. Am I close? Okay.
You got
Uh,
it.
Yes, and a bit about Stephanie. She leads child welfare and juvenile justice policy work at Children First, a Philadelphia-based organization that works to improve the lives of children in the Southeast and across the Commonwealth by developing initiatives and advocating for quality healthcare, childcare, public education, and family stability. It's in that role that she advocates at the state and local level for policies and investments to reduce the number of children involved in the juvenile justice and the child welfare systems, and to ensure that children who do end up in these systems receive services that help them heal from trauma and stay on track to a bright future, which we absolutely love. She holds a master's in social work from the University of Cincinnati and a master's in public policy from DePaul University. Everyone use the virtual clap option and help me welcome Stephanie into our virtual space today. And then we have also Nadia Mozafar. How close am I to
Mozart.
you?
Yeah, close, pretty
Okay.
close.
All right. I should know that because Nadia is definitely a friend of the Black Girls Equity Alliance. She's a senior attorney at the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia. Her work focuses on advancing educational rights and opportunities for children in the juvenile justice and child welfare systems, economic justice issues, and protecting the rights of young people in the adult justice system. She's led numerous trainings and presentations for lawyers, advocates, and policymakers on reforms regarding costs and fees in the system. She also co-authored a 2018 report that many of us have seen called The Price of Justice, the High Cost of Free Counsel for Youth in the Juvenile Justice System, detailing the costs associated with court-appointed counsel in the country or around the country. But she has significant experience, like Stephanie, with federal and state legislative advocacy. Please also clap it up for Nadia. So before I jump into any specific questions, I know you all had possibly a slide or two to just share with us about what's going on with current legislative efforts that are affecting our girls. Stephanie, should I turn it over to you first? Did you want to share out?
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. I hope everyone can hear me. If for some reason you can't, please say so. So hi, I'm Stephanie Arbutina. I'm really happy to be here. First, I want to just give a little tiny bit of background and context, kind of especially aligning with the theme of your summit. Um, we at Children First PA, in partnership with JLC and several other partner organizations, including the Black Girls Equity Alliance, are convening statewide advocates around juvenile justice reform. And some of the background around this is some things that we know to be true is that most kids, most young people aren't on a path to adult crime. The deeper they go into the legal system, the worse the outcomes. They have an increased likelihood of arrest and rearrest and reincarceration, less likely to graduate high school, worse physical and mental health overall. I wanted to share a little bit of data so you can see kind of where Pennsylvania is in this system, like how we line up as a state. Where do girls fit into this and where do Black youth fit into this? I want to share with you that we don't have statewide publicly available data on the intersection of race and gender and sex. And everything is still reported in the gender binary. So you'll see some gaps here. Like I can't tell you how Black girls in PA are doing. We can kind of like infer based on what we know and some deeper work that's been done in communities, but just bearing that in mind when you see the statewide numbers that it's going to be missing that really key information. I'm going to put up just like 2 slides, and I hope you can see that because I'm using 2 monitors, and sometimes I can't master my technology. um, um, but this slide gives a little bit of data around the racial disparities in the juvenile justice system in Pennsylvania. So in 2023, Black youth, and I will preface this by saying this is with Allegheny and Philadelphia incorporated in here. As you probably know, if you're from Allegheny County or any place that has an urban center, you can imagine, that the numbers of Black young people are higher in those areas. And so this represents all of PA. So all of the rural counties where there are like pretty significant white populations, as opposed to, if you look at the urban counties more in depth, the numbers definitely change. But Black youth in PA made up 38% of delinquency disposition. So the kids that were found to be delinquent in Pennsylvania would only represent 12% of the total Pennsylvania youth population. This difference gets really stark in the urban areas. They also comprise higher representation of kids that are likely to be incarcerated. So over 60% of secure detention admissions. So that's the pre-trial incarceration, and 47.5% of placement. So that's the post-trial confinement option incarceration. Girls are represented less in this. They're less likely to run into the system. They represent just a quarter of allegations overall. And I will say that this Allegheny County actually lines up kind of with a statewide average around that 25-26% mark. And they represent about a third of school-related allegations. They're less likely to be transferred to adult court. They're less likely to be, they're more represented in diversion than boys. And they are more likely to receive probation than placement. We know based on research that girls are at low risk of reoffending and are more likely to be intersecting with the system because of peer fights, confrontations with staff at school, and then family conflict. But yet that's not always reflected in the response to them. They're treated, sometimes our standardized responses are the same for girls as they are for boys, even though like we know based on research that they're less likely to do something again once they've done it the first time. And like I said, there's no publicly available statewide data right now on the intersection of race and gender. I think it exists, we just don't see it. Kids in PA, the top reason, and Nadia will talk more about the legislation in a sec, that kids in Pennsylvania get involved in the youth justice system is for not paying fines and fees. So they get a ticket for something that's not considered a delinquency allegation. They don't pay that ticket, they don't pay the fine, they don't pay the fees, and then they're on probation. And maybe they violate that probation that they shouldn't have been on in the first place, and then they end up deeper in the system. Kids are in out-of-home placement for things that are not necessarily violent in nature, not necessarily felony in nature. So this is just some important context to have. I'm going to pause my share there. I will say that the system in PA has over time over-relied on detention and out-of-home placement. Like I said, kids are there for misdemeanors. On average, kids spend about 16 months in placement, which is over an entire school year, which is a lot for a young person. Allegheny, for its part, has not seen a significant uptick in placement since the pandemic, which is actually atypical of the rest of the state. There has been a pretty significant uptick in the system, and that is not reflected in Allegheny County data. There's been a continued decline in detention admissions as well, most starkly with the closure of the Schumann Center. So we have yet to see how the reopening will impact that, whereas other counties have also seen an increase. So just wanted to provide a little bit of that context. We are working in coalition to change this data statewide, to change the number of kids in the system, the harsh punishment of kids in the system, and to ensure that those racial disparities are eliminated. We don't want to see Black young people, Black girls, Black boys treated more punitively than their peers, and we don't want to see any kids in jail if we can help it. And so we're advocating for policies to that end. And Nadia can talk more about what that is, what those are.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And
one question, Nadia, before you jump into your presentation on legislation. Just wanted to ask really quickly, based upon what we're seeing here in Allegheny County, because it tracks a bit. Can you say a bit more, both of you, about girls ending up in the system for family issues or family conflicts? Either one of you.
Yeah, Nadia, you're welcome to speak on this as well. I will say this is something that actually got dug into really in depth in a Philadelphia report. They did a report that focused on girls, and basically they are found both locally and nationally that the largest driver of girls being arrested was assaults, but they tended to be, and boys had a more variety in the things they were getting arrested for, and more so were being like robbery, thefts, things like that. But girls were getting into fights. And so it was literally looking like they were coming out from lashing out at peers for things, or adults that they know, so family members and or like school staff. And what they found, like in the research, was basically that this could be stemming from a response to trauma that they were experiencing in their life, whether that was gender violence, whether that was like interpersonal, interfamily violence, et cetera. And so because they found that girls were self-reporting trauma at greater rates, than other kids that were arrested for the same crimes, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Is it the report called Overlooked and Over
That's it.
Scrutinized?
Yes.
Okay, I'll drop it in the chat, everybody. Thank you for that. All right, I'll shut up now. Nadia, please take over.
And, I think I wanted to echo Stephanie's point about just like the sheer lack of helpful data around so many of these topics. But I think that report did highlight how Black girls were, in Philly, just disproportionately represented in the system, similar to, the same types of racial inequities that we see throughout the justice system. So, very problematic, not fairly. And I think in our legislative efforts this year and in the past few years, we have really looked at kind of robust, large scale changes to the juvenile justice system. Many of you will recall, I think this is history that we're all kind of familiar with at this point, that there were numerous pretty horrible stories that came out, Glen Mills, Wordsworth, other facilities across the country, across the state that, were just treating kids in the justice system, in the juvenile legal system very poorly. And Governor Tom Wolf had this task force and they had a lot of meetings and many of us participated. And, a couple of years later, we're still kind of fighting for the legislative changes that the task force and all of us kind of recommended. And so I wanted to highlight 4 pieces of legislation, but also just frame all of this as we are very late in the legislative cycle in Pennsylvania. The legislative cycle, I think there's a few days in December this year, but we're pretty much near the end. And especially with the election, we're not all feeling super optimistic about what we can accomplish this year. But I think, as we'll talk about, legislation is a pretty long road, and kind of knowing what we have been working on, I think is helpful to know kind of what we wanted to do in the future. So just really quickly, I think that there's 4 pieces of legislation that are very key that I wanted to highlight. So I'll start with HB 1381, and as I'm talking, I can put some of the bill pieces into the chat as well. But HB 1381 is really basically like our biggest omnibus bill, I would say, and that covers just a number of different recommendations that came out of the juvenile justice task force. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And so the 4 key policy changes. It expands and standardizes the use of diversion across the state. It eliminates fines and fees, which is something that you all know that I, have been working on, and Gwen's Girls and Juvenile Law Center has partnered on a number of times, given, how often fees kind of add to the problems of the system. It focuses on limiting detention and out-of-home placements on kids with serious offenses and needs that can't be met in the community. And it eliminates direct file, which essentially means that all young people start in the juvenile justice system, and then they, after a hearing, they may go to the adult system, but it's not an automatic, which is what happens now for numerous offenses. So, overall, I think the goal of 1381 has other provisions too, but these are really the ones that we have been highlighting kind of across and in our advocacy. And so I particularly wanted to highlight the expanding and standardizing the use of diversion. And I think that's important. And I would really encourage folks in this audience to keep an eye out on that, because some of the research that's come out about girls in the system highlight how there aren't enough diversion programs available for them, or there's not enough placement, there's not enough, you know, and we don't want to be in a world where we're trying to like make the juvenile justice system better for girls. Like, we want to keep girls out of the system. But one thing to highlight is that oftentimes when these new revolutionary, you know, or like thoughtful programs are created, there's not enough spots for girls, or there's not enough services for girls. So I think keeping that in mind as we look at more diversion programs and these types of new programs would be really helpful. But for now, this is what we, you know, kind of advocated for together. I think there was, you know, Stephanie's going to talk a little bit more later about the future of legislation and kind of how things are going. I think there's still small bits of hope that things may go through the House this year, but for the most part, I think we're thinking about how to strategically look at these changes and these advocacy pieces for next session. Whether it's in one bill, whether it's in several bills that kind of break up these pieces. And so that's very much part of the conversation. That continues to be very much part of the conversation right now. But overall, these are, you know, the serious pieces of legislation that were put into this one bill. So I'm just going to pause and see if there's any questions about that before we go into a couple of the other ones. Yes.
I just had a question, and that is, can these be done at the county level until the state actually acts, or are these things that have to be done at the state level?
So I think that there are, for the various pieces, there's definitely elements that each county can do. So for example, and actually, the more the county does, I think the easier it gets for us to pass legislation at the state level, because sometimes it's the counties that are standing in the way of certain things. So every county can create more diversion programs that kind of fit within these things, and then give prosecutors or other folks, probation officers, et cetera, more options of like where to put their young people. Every county, you know, counties can make certain decisions on fees and fines, although many of them are mandated at the state level. So I think that there are limited, you know, direct file. It's a little harder because so to answer your question, some of these can be done at the state level, or some policy decisions can be made that further these goals, but legislation is needed to like truly make the change. And I would say direct file is probably the one that's the hardest, because it doesn't give prosecutors any leniency or any discretion on whether to you know, whether to try a young person in the juvenile system or the adult system. They have to do it. And so that is one that it would be hard for the counties to do much. But, you know, if a county wants to make a difference, at least what they can do is really scrutinize the cases that they do have discretion over, and ensure more kids are being placed in the juvenile justice system than the adult one. So yeah, so to recap, I think there's definitely things counties can do for all of these. It is most protective to pass legislation at the state level, and then at some point they will be hindered because of state legislation.
Nadia, can you just say a bit here about your fees and fines work? Because we have been trying to do some local advocacy around that, meeting roadblocks, unfortunately. But yes, to Marsha's point, that is something that I know certain counties are seeing some traction around.
Sure. So there is a slate of fines fees and fines that are state law. So like, you know, there's like a chart of them that I can provide you. But besides that, I think, first of all, a lot of counties have kind of local fees or things that they assess. One of the worst costs I think that parents face, this doesn't happen in Philadelphia anymore, but is parents having to pay child support when their kids are in detention or placement. The state DHS has officially said that that is counties have the discretion to not charge that. So nothing at the state, like we would love a state law that says you can't charge it, but there's nothing in the state law that prevents counties from charging it. Municipal court kind of fees, municipal courts sometimes kind of make their own decisions. They're a little lands onto themselves in terms of what they can charge. And so there's a lot, there's definitely a lot that could be done at the county level. And once again, the more that counties step forward and say, this is bad policy, we don't want to do this anyway, the easier it gets for the state to make changes. And the other thing, and this goes to fees and fines, but this also goes to all of these provisions, it's a lot of times we see some of like the most innovative, helpful things for young people, starting with pilot programs kind of at the local levels, and that can be scaled up. So, and especially when we're, talking about diversion programs or, programs that can keep kids out of placement, that some of that just is really nicely done at the local level and then can serve as models for the rest of the state.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you.
Great. And so there's a couple other bills that I wanted to highlight. First, there's House Bill 1600, which is really directed towards creating more oversight and creating more better accountability for juvenile justice facilities. And so a couple of the things that it does is that it limits out-of-home placement, both for youth in the juvenile legal system and the child welfare system, by requiring that DHS prioritize that kids get to stay with their families or receive services within their communities. It limits some of the worst practices that we see: solitary confinement, chemical restraints, invasive searches. And, when I was reading some of the descriptions of the invasive searches, it's like terrible for everyone, but especially knowing that so many girls go into the system with, sexual trauma in their past or other horrible histories. The searches can be like particularly harmful and triggering. And so this bill would really limit that and improve the grievance process. So as young people in our systems face problems, there is something that they can do about it. And along that same vein, there is a bill that passed in the House, which would create a permanent office of the child advocate. So right now we have a statewide child advocate who was appointed by Governor Wolf, and this was done by executive order. And so this legislation would create a permanent office of the child advocate. And the idea is, again, that young people would have somewhere to provide their grievances, and there would be a branch of the government that would go through and review these complaints and do monitoring. And so, ideally, we would love to live in a world where young people aren't in facilities, but until that is achieved, some of these things can be some like stopgap measures to prevent more harm. And then finally, we also, as a coalition, worked on HB 1708, which encouraged, really tried to combat the problems of young people getting into trouble in the legal system because of things that were happening in school. So encouraging school-based diversion programs, limiting arrests or petitions or any sort of legal consequences for things that have low-level things that happen in school, developing oversight and monitoring for education and placement. So all of this kind of spans the experiences and like some of the biggest problems that we see with young people in the justice system. And I think there are things that we're going to continue to work on in the new legislative session, although it may look a little bit different, but these are all our kind of legislation to watch and keep an ear out for further info.
Thank you, Nadia. Nadia, can you repeat that second? What was the number or the name of the bill?
There was House Bill 1600, which is juvenile justice facility accountability, and then House Bill 2175 is the State Office of the Child Advocate, and then House Bill 1708 is the school diversion program one. And I have all of them pulled up so I can just paste them all into the chat.
That'd be
Okay,
good. Thanks.
thank you. Any additional questions around specific pieces of legislation for Nadia or Stephanie before we get into some of the moderated chat? All right. So I'm gonna pitch the first question to Stephanie, since I know Nadia is looking up some bills to drop in the chat for us. And we've kind of answered this, but I would love to hear more of your thoughts. And it's that public policy and legislative change can feel like turning a ship. So moving very, very slowly, sometimes a bit like Sisyphus. So how do you recommend that folks who are doing the work, who may be on the ground or in more of a direct practice or a grassroots advocacy space, participate and stay motivated in some of the advocacy efforts that you all are doing, for example, at the state level?
Yeah, I mean, you're not joking when you say it can feel very slow, but I think what we're doing while we want to change things right away. I mean, folks watch the news, you know that we're fighting a really hard narrative in the public right now. So there is something really strong to be said about changing that narrative and its role in long-term change. And so to the extent that people can, you folks on this call, people, you're having conversations to dispel some of the misinformation that's out there about young people, about what their behavior is, what it can lead to or not lead to. That gets us closer to the goal. If you or someone you know has been personally impacted by the youth legal system, sharing your story with a legislator, helping folks that make policy connect a human story with the policy that they're making. We often see that when young people, system impacted young people or who are now adults come and meet with legislators, kind of their rhetoric sort of washes away in those moments. And it's extremely powerful for them to connect. And for some of us, it may be easy to make that connection, but for others, it's not. That like a person isn't defined by the worst thing they ever did, or a mistake that they made, and to realize that like you did something as a kid, that doesn't mean that your life needs to be totally, like your trajectory needs to be totally derailed for that. And you can still build your future, and you can still go to school, and you can still have a family or do whatever you want. And when they meet the people that have done that, or have been negatively impacted by the system and been prohibited from doing that in some way, it changes minds. So that would be like the biggest thing people can do about it, and celebrate the small wins when you do change someone's mind. Like that is a massive victory. And there are some bills that are likely to hit Governor Shapiro's desk this week. Senate bills 169 and 170. They passed are all the way through the House. Strike that, reverse it. They are all the way through the Senate, and they are on the finish line in the House right now, about to get a full floor vote and then be sent to his desk. And while they don't address the reasons kids come into the system, they're a start. And so can help us say they address expungement of juvenile records and change the time frame for placement reviews. So checking in on what's going on when kids are in placement, changes it from 6 months to 3 months. There were a couple of the Juvenile Justice Task Force recommendations. We can have conversations about building on those to make real transformative change. And then we just motivate each other and celebrate. And Nadia, I'm sure you have stuff to add.
Thank you for bringing those two bills up as well, Stephanie and Nadia.
Yeah, I was gonna I'll just echo one more time I think every lobbyist, expert in legislative advocacy that we've ever talked to has said you need real stories and like face-to-face meetings and relationship building. So I think, you know, again, in addition to the storytelling and like sharing perspective, the other piece I would uplift is relationship building with legislators. And, you know, this is not just for these bills. This is just like they are our legislators and their job is to work for us and do things for us. And even beyond what they can pass about juvenile justice, there's like other bills that you might care about and things that affect you and your families, or you know, my legislator sends out these community events where you can like bring all your paperwork to her and you can shred it at her office. I mean, just even little things like that. I think keeping an eye out and building those relationships is a win that we can focus on and will make change. And, you know, I always add a caveat that, you know, not every person, unfortunately, in our Pennsylvania legislature is like a safe person for everyone to be with. You know, I wouldn't take all youth there. I wouldn't, you know, and so I just want to caveat that by knowing like sometimes that's much harder, but there's, I would say the vast majority of people, like even if your views are like quite different and you have different values, you can build a professional relationship enough with, and focusing on that as a win, as Stephanie said, I think is really helpful as well.
Thank you. And I think you all also demonstrate the importance of coalition building. And I think that helps with the motivation piece as well. I mean, we know something about that as the Black Girls Equity Alliance, but you know, this work, because sometimes it can be so tiresome and cumbersome, it feels good to have colleagues and co-conspirators in the work. So thank you. We're also definitely lifting up that narrative change role that Stephanie mentioned and the relationship building with legislators that Nadia mentioned. So thank you both. So let's get messy for a minute. It's my favorite thing to do. So you mentioned, Stephanie, those two bills that likely will be voted on very soon, if not today, maybe sometime this week or next. But what's going on with 1381? I mean, these were things that the task force agreed to. The task force that had been doing this work for years, that were appointed by the previous governor. How did we get here that we still do not have this bill actually being voted on and enacted?
How messy?
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna say the frustration of that, I share it. You know, the politics in this state are this Commonwealth are an interesting one, are interesting. I mean, we have a split legislature in that one party controls one chamber and one party controls the other. And it's the first time that one party has had control of the chamber. And so that plays into a lot of what moves or doesn't move, and actually can make it really challenging to get things across the finish line. For a number of reasons. One is that, you know, parties don't want to let each other have victories. There's also this question of narrow majorities and electoral politics. And so we've got an election coming up in exactly 1 month. And so a lot of folks have contested seats, and especially folks that live in purple districts either may be swayed toward a more progressive stance on approach to the legal system, or don't want to be seen as being so-called soft on crime. And so there's a huge reluctance to make some of these changes because of that fear, right? And so what we've gotten into a situation with is this kind of inertia around making anything really substantive happen. And this is also an issue in which, like, not everyone in the state sees themselves in this issue. Like, I'm sure we can all say we know someone who's been impacted by the carceral system in some way, shape, or form, but on the day-to-day, your average voter is probably more likely to say they're worried about community safety than they are about how we're treating kids or adults in the legal system. I mean, so you can imagine who's louder, and whether that's informed by, you know, what science and research tells us makes good policy, or what like the news tells us we need to do, or what sounds good in the moment when you're campaigning. That's, where we live. So nothing has moved past that point. But now we're looking to next year and really trying to strategize about things that are more likely to move. And of course, the election will matter in terms of like who is championing things, if things change in the makeup of the chambers. But we're exploring more politically feasible ways to get this work done, like a budget strategy to expand diversion. Instead of saying the counties all have to do XYZ, how about we provide them with some resources to do that? And then when they have the resources, say you have to do XYZ, for example, in terms of like requiring diversion as so maybe a both and strategy there. So that's just one way. The omnibus bill 1381 was really hard for folks to latch on to all of it. So we had a hard time finding people to co-sponsor that because they could find one thing they didn't love. That's the risk you run with a really big comprehensive bill. So for that in particular, that was a challenge we ran into. I don't know, I don't want to take up all the air. If there's anything else you want to add to that.
No, I think if we're getting into specifics, I think even, when I naively saw that the Democrats who, we're all nonpartisan, but we know that one party generally supports reform efforts more than others. I naively thought like, oh, then we can kind of get everything passed. But there is a lot of diversity of thought in the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania. And, we had at least a couple of conversations with some more conservative legislators who kind of were concerned about the exact, like, our kids being appropriately held accountable under these new provisions. And so there seemed to, kind of echoing back to everything we've been saying, that there seemed to still be a lot of work to do, changing narratives, even amongst folks that we would think would be on our side. But the one very small piece of optimism I would say is that, like, for a lot of those conversations, I felt that we could get them on board if we showed them more data and we brought more story, had more stories, and we like did all of the relationship building and kind of things that we've talked about versus, I think sometimes you talk to certain legislatures and you're like, you're just never going to be on my side, regardless of what I show you. So yeah, I think that the dynamics of Pennsylvania and like the variety of folks that we have kind of across the state and their needs. And yeah, I mean, when I don't really ever watch like real TV, but I've been watching the Phillies, and every ad is like this terrible, like, fear mongering ad about crime. And these just things are making our jobs like very, very hard.
Yes.
Yeah. I, as most of you know, I'm not in Pennsylvania. And so because I've done all of my work really in Pittsburgh and some work in Philly, I often forget that the entire state is not Philly and Pittsburgh. It is not Allegheny County. It is not Philadelphia. And there are very, very divergent thoughts. So thank you for that. Sarah dropped in the chat. For folks who don't know, Sarah Nevels leads our Caring Connections, which is our pre-arrest diversion work. So going back to that county-based diversion effort that Nadia lifted up. She says, this is great info and actionable ways we can advocate. So thank you all for that. And also, Sarah, if you have anything you want to chime in about, especially related to the power of storytelling, we would love to hear it, being that you work so closely with our children. But moving on to another question, as you all know, the BGEA focuses on 4 key areas affecting Black girls and gender expansive youth. Our kind of, from the beginning, action areas have been health and wellness, education, juvenile justice, and child welfare. We've drilled down a bit more specifically as of late, but for the most part, those are our 4 umbrella areas. Are there additional causes and issues that we should be noting? And so I'm thinking here about some of the anti-CRT legislation that was creeping up, or the Don't Say Gay bills that are happening around the country as it relates to different populations that have been marginalized. What should we be paying attention to within or outside of those large bucket areas that you all have noticed?
Yeah. So I tried to think, I was thinking about this as you were talking in the terms of in the buckets. And so some things to keep, there are things to certainly defend against, but some positive things to keep an eye out for. One thing that's moving in Pennsylvania is paid family leave, which would definitely contribute to, the health of both children and their parents, if they were able to take time off work to care for a new baby, or a sick loved one, or a new child that they adopted, or any of those things, basically to have that paid, similar to some of our neighboring states like New Jersey that have a a program that is in at least partially it's like an employer benefit kind of. You pay into it and then you get it out. I was a beneficiary in New Jersey, thankfully, and it saved us when I had an employer that did not have that. And so there is bipartisan legislation for paid family leave in Pennsylvania. And we are part of a coalition working on that. So if that's something anybody is interested in getting involved in, be happy to connect you with the folks working on that. There's a national effort, of course, as well. But there's also something going on right here. And Pennsylvania was one of like the only bipartisan movements in this country. So it's exciting for a purple state to have that. Of course, the issue of childcare, funding both here in the state, and then also that's a conversation on the national election stage right now. What would it look like to cap family income that could be paid on for childcare? Because we all know that cost can be really burdensome and keeps people out of the workforce. We're looking at mental health access here. There's a campaign that's growing to expand mental health access for children and parents. Education, you mentioned like the CRT and don't say gay type legislation. I think in Pennsylvania that's been more visible in individual school districts. So if folks are keeping finger on the pulse of your local school board and what's going on in when those I think a lot of it was squashed, thankfully, but it might be popping up again. Some of the more really concerning things, that rhetoric that was happening in the schools. The state, there's education funding. There was a transformative education investment in the PA state budget. So if your district got adequacy funding, you might want to look and see like what your district is doing with that funding. And then I think the last thing is like on the defense piece, as folks think about school safety and what that looks like, and we would like to get away from punitive environments in schools, because especially, we want school to be a place where kids want to be, first of all, but also we don't, those policies that are exclusionary tend to impact, of course, Black and brown youth the most. And so when new things are popping up, what is the response? Are we seeing kids funneled into the justice system for school behavior that could be addressed otherwise? And how can we provide support to students and school? And what resources could be in the school to prevent that? Those are just some of the things that are popping up. There's probably more. I don't know, Nadia, if there's anything I missed that you want to talk about.
I think you covered them beautifully. I think the one other nuance, and this is also kind of more at the county level, is like bathroom bills and like policies around those. And, I just saw this horrible article in the Inquirer just yesterday, which my friend Christina Moon, who works at Education Law Center, which is also an organization that we all work with, commented on, is that they had a gender neutral bathroom in a Philly area school district or in a school, and then they decided to put a window in the bathroom because they were like, oh, we're worried about kids smoking or whatever. And everyone, it has since been boarded up, but I think at these individual school levels, there are some pretty horrible practices that are, I think we can often can be avenues for advocacy.
Thank you. Sarah says in the chat, very local for us would be comprehensive sexuality education, which is something that we have been working on with Planned Parenthood and PAR. And we'll talk more about that at the summit. You will hear about that work in 2 spaces. So we hope to see you on Friday. We've been doing a lot of work around the code of conduct with some partners at ELC, and also some dress code advocacy within there, and also working with colleagues at 412 Justice and other local organizations around school PPS, specifically school closures. So thank you for lifting that up, Sarah. And also I appreciate that this conversation it's kind of morphing into what is happening state and locally, right?
Mhm.
Because all of these things affect one another. So thank you all for that. So we've talked a bit about the narrative change, which obviously involves storytelling, but we have today with us, I would be remiss if I didn't call out Emanasia. Hey girl, hey, thank you so much for joining us. Emanasia has been a part of our work for a very long time. I don't know, Emanasia, when did you start at Gwen's Girls?
As oh, excuse me. I started at Gwen's Girls when I was about 12 years old. I was
Okay.
about 12.
And now you
22
are
now.
back. You're 22 now, so
I'm 22.
a full decade, and we are so proud of you, and now working with us as well, right?
Yes.
Thank
I am a program assistant. Uh, I'm pretty happy with the position that I play, and I'm very happy that, oftentimes I get to interact with the girls or assist in any way that I can. Yeah, I'm just happy to be here. It's a beautiful conversation we're having.
Thank you, Emanasia, and you will be at the summit on Friday, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll get to give
Continue.
you a hug. Good, good, good. We're proud of you. So that then brings me to how are we continuing to center youth voice? And I'm so happy you mentioned, Nadia, that everything ain't for everybody. And there are some people that we do not need to allow to be in proximity to our young people because they cannot be trusted due to their positions around youth well-being. Just a little different from ours, correct? So how, as advocates, do we ensure that the things we are promoting and are calling for are actually coming directly from our young people who are affected and impacted by these systems? I'll start with Nadia and then I'll go to Stephanie.
Sure. Thanks. And Emanasia, lovely to meet you. Congratulations on 10 years with Gwen's Girls. But I think some of this is kind of reflecting on what we've already talked about in terms of relationship building and storytelling and ensuring that the youth advocates that we work with are front and center of those pieces. And really, I think at Juvenile Law Center, at the Youth Safety Coalition, at the Debt Free Justice Campaign, like our ideal model is always starting, like having the youth lead and sharing their recommendations. And we are there to kind of, provide the context or to like appropriately massage it into something that will be palatable to some whatever form, not palatable, but like what, fit for the forum. Is it a legislation? Is it a policy piece? Is it a media piece? Like kind of massage it into the right format. And so I think it's very important, but the only way you get there, as I think we all on this call know, is by developing relationships with young people, developing trust with young people, and building up their expertise, because it's not just that young people have to share their like personal traumatic experiences. It's just that they have policy recommendations and they have, like really helpful insights. And we just need to make sure they are able to put that into their policy and be part of these coalitions. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna tweak the question a little bit, Stephanie, and ask you, when have you seen efforts to bring in youth voice done right, and when have you seen it done wrong? Because I know at times it can also feel a bit transactional, and we don't want that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the work Juvenile Law Center is a really good example of doing it well. And that like they have invested in leadership development and strong relationships with the youth advocates that they work with. And I think that's really important. It's not this is not a one time thing where like, hey, I need you to come to this meeting with me. That's the wrong way, right? Is you come with it, I need you here, tell them your story, and then there's no follow-up. There's no, relationship there. There's no like input on the ongoing work that's being done. It's just, who can I bring? I need someone that fits this criteria for this meeting, whether it's they've been involved with the justice system, they're from this community, et cetera. Doing it well is, and a lot of times those relationships are built up through, programs that young people have engaged in. And then they felt like it was beneficial and then wanted that to be wanted that for someone else and wanted to change things for someone else. But again, it's that it's an ongoing relationship. It's an investment. You're talking to young people at all stages of your process when you're you're developing your priorities. What do they want to see? What would have helped them? What did they have that they want other people to have? Making that into policy, and then also finding out what they want to do. Is it right? Is it go meet with people? Is it just be a part of the behind the scenes convos? And again, keeping that going. And we're building this coalition. So I would also plug that if there are young people that anyone is, if you are an impacted young person, or if you are working with impacted young people who would like to be engaged in this work and would like to be part of this coalition and be in the legislative advocacy, to like let us know, because that's something that we want to have at all stages.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Speaking of the work happening at all stages, I'm also reminded of the role of young people and their voice being part of philanthropic conversations, and how important that is as well, because so much of our work is funded not just by individual donors and maybe some funding from the state or the federal government, but it comes from foundations. And from what I've seen, there's not nearly enough youth voice happening behind the scenes as well. And when it's done right, we have some great programs that are being funded. And when it's done wrong, we have some real mediocre programs that are being funded year after year. So youth voice everywhere, as Stephanie said. Thank you for that reminder. As we wrap up, I want to just ask folks if they have any questions, any additional thoughts, anything that kind of sparked for you today. Feel free to unmute and to jump into the conversation. So in that case, my last question is first for Nadia. How can folks join your efforts, whether it be through JLC or the Youth Safety Coalition? And then I'll ask the same to Stephanie.
Sure. Well, I think I think we all, as all of us that live in Pennsylvania, kind of can join efforts individually as calling your reps, building relationships with them, being engaged on the issues. So that's one level. I'll let Stephanie talk more about joining the Youth Justice Coalition. And then for folks that are, especially my focus and specialty is on the fees and fines work. So for folks that are interested in learning more about state or local campaigns on the fees and fines elimination, please feel free to reach out to me. And we have a website, debtfreejustice.org, that houses like a lot of resources and information from around the country. And so that would be worth looking at as well.
Thank you, Nadia. Stephanie?
And for me, I'll plug my email into the chat if you're interested in joining the Youth Safety Coalition, being a part of legislative conversations. Would love to follow up with you. We can have a one-on-one. I can give more, background about what's the coalition been working on, who's on it, et cetera. But I'll plug my email in and we can go from there. And then if any of the other topics I talked about are really sparking your interest, it's not me that is involved in that, but I can connect you to someone who is. So again, you can just send me an email and I'd be happy to make those connections.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'll give you a chance to plug your information in the chat. So if there are no additional questions, and I do want to just remind people to join us today for what we are calling our Thriving Challenges. The whole topic around cultivating a community where Black girls thrive, we talked about community for a reason, because we want to ensure that we are also doing our healing work while supporting our girls in their ability to thrive. And so our journaling prompt today is, in what areas of my life do I need to set boundaries or say no? In what areas of my life do I need to set boundaries or say no? How can I assert my needs and prioritize my well-being this week? And this is on Whova, the same link you use to get to us, as Amy is highlighting it there for us. And then your Thriving Challenge is to meditate for only 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. Those are your self-care practices that we encourage you to engage in today. Otherwise, outside of that, we will see you all tomorrow for a conversation about unpacking childhood trauma. And we will see you Thursday at the HERE Foundation's anti-violence walk. And we'll see you on Friday at the summit. Girl, it's just dedicate your life to Black Girls Equity Alliance this week. It's happening. All right. Take care.